Good afternoon and welcome to Digital Humanities Connections, a conversation about the future of digital humanities. This is an event sponsored by both Cleveland State University, especially the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities, and also by Case Western Reserve University, especially the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, the Kelvin Smith Library, which building we are in, of course, and the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm Bill Deal. I'm a professor of religious studies here at CWRU, and also am the fairly recently demented digital humanities faculty liaison for the Baker Nord Center, and I am looking forward to learning lots of stuff from all of you because I am just getting used to what all of this means. In any event, we are very pleased to have all of you join us for what we hope will be an ongoing series of meetings, summits, workshops, and other programs related to the digital humanities. Mark is going to talk more about this, but we want to underscore that although there is a schedule in front of you, this is an unconference, which is to say we will wing it when we need to wing it, and we'll see what happens. Before I turn the program over to Mark, and the introduction of our special guests, I want to thank the following individuals and organizations who made today's program possible. First off, I want to thank Aaron Bell. Aaron, why don't you raise your hand? There you go. As many of you know, Aaron is project coordinator for the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities at CSU. I also want to acknowledge Lee Zickel. Lee is our brilliant digital humanities coordinator at the Baker Nord Center. They both worked very hard to organize this event and the registration and the website that you've seen and all of that. So we're very appreciative to their help with this. Thank you. I want to especially thank Cleveland State University for co-sponsoring the program and especially for bringing in our special guests today from George Mason University to share their knowledge with us. This is an exciting moment, I think, for all of us here in Northeast Ohio who are interested in digital humanities. I also want to thank the Kelvin Smith Library for providing the space for the event. I'd like to acknowledge Tom Nab. Tom, wake up, Tom. You didn't know this, did you? No. Tom is our Chief Information Officer in the College of Arts and Sciences, and his group has provided some funding support for today's event. Finally, and this wasn't on the list I was sent, but I wanted to thank Maggie Kaminsky. Is Maggie here? Is she in the back? Anyway, Maggie, who you probably met when you came in here, is the administrative director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, and she has worked incredibly hard in organizing and overseeing logistics for today's event, so I'm very happy about that. Finally, I want to thank our former director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, Dr. Ann Helmreich, who is back in town this weekend, and so she could be here. And Ann is the one who, in fact, got me my position at Baker Nord Center. And she and Mark Thibault have had long conversations about digital humanities in Northeast Ohio, so it's really great to have you here, even for part of the time, Ann, so thank you. All right, I'm done. Let's have some fun. Mark Thibault, Cleveland State University.
So thank you for coming. This is an exceptional turnout. I will only say thanks to Aaron, Lee, and Maggie. I won't introduce them all again. And thanks, Bill. This has been great. We had coffee, Tom, and a whole bunch of folks. And we planned this in, 2 hours? In a kind of magical, and that's the magic of an unconference. An unconference is not a conference. That's hence the word, the prefix "un," which I'll talk about in a second. Before I begin, I actually want to say thanks to Ann too. The digital humanities, I think the power of it is that it begins with the humanities. And the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, through Ann, had a museum. I don't even remember what the title was, but it was a museum's workshop where Anne brought together, oh, I don't know, 12 or 14 of us, including Daniel here in the room. And we talked just about museums and what it means to think about museums in the 21st century. It was an exceptional professional moment for me because after graduate school, when you get in the university, you never talk to your colleagues anymore. And in fact, that's, that was a great experience. And I think the cool thing about Unconferences is that it's a chance to talk to one another in entirely new ways. An Unconference is organized, is based on the Center for History and New Media. I think it was Jeremy was one of the inventors of the That Camp series of Unconferences. Is that right, Jeremy? One of them, along with Dave Lester, right? And they modeled it after bar camps in the computer world. And the idea is you bring a bunch of really smart people together, people interested in the same issues, and you find a way to talk about your common interests, but not in the realm of organized talks. Rather than have an audience where somebody speaks at the audience, we have an audience that speaks to one another. And so that really is the goal today. It's meant to break down barriers between faculty and student, between faculty and archivist, between faculty and librarian, between librarian and archivist. And I'm sure there are a whole bunch of other barriers meant to be broken down. We've violated that by having them formally speak before you. So we ask that you ignore that violation and the rest of the day be organized entirely around us talking to one another and engaging one another. After this, after they talk, after the violation of the rules, we'll do something called lightning rounds, where for 3 minutes we will each present something, not all of us, but some portion of us, that we're interested in. I'm going to tell you about Cleveland Historical. Oh, yes, that's right. Cleveland Historical. Well, I'm going to plug it, right? I'm going to get up here and say, oh, here's what we're doing. But if you're curious, and you can download it. So that's, sorry, I had to plug that. But I want you to talk for 3 minutes. Aaron and Lee are going around inviting people up. I already went around and invited you up. I would love to see a mad dash for the stage as everybody wanted to get their 3 minutes of fame. If you go beyond 3 minutes, we're going to ask Jim Calder to man a computer somewhere and bring Keyboard Cat on that will start ringing. And so there you go, something just like that. All of which is actually a good sign to me not to talk too long. Just to introduce myself, I'm Mark Tebow. I'm the director of the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities at Cleveland State. We're doing a number of these kinds of digital projects, and a partner where I learned about digital humanities was at the first That Camp 3 years ago. I went into that conference having a sense of what the digital humanities was and having done some sort of work in the digital humanities, but otherwise being totally new to it. And I left finding a community of digital humanists. And I hope that's what we can find today, but not a community that's national, but a community that's also local, people we can call up, get together with for coffee. That is one of our goals. Let me introduce our friends from the Center for History and New Media. We have speaking today about the digital humanities, Tom Scheinfeldt, who's the managing director at CHNM, also the co-director of the Emeka project. We have Sharon Leon next to me. She's the director of public projects. She also is the co-director of the Emeka project, among many other duties that they do. Also, we have Jeremy Boggs. Jeremy, raise your hand. Jeremy is currently at the Center for History and New Media, but he's about to go take a position in humanities design at Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia. So the Center for History and New Media will miss him, but the University of Virginia will welcome him with open arms. Sheila Brennan is the Associate Director of Public Programs or Public Projects at the Center for History and New Media. They'll both be available in and out all day to join us in our conversations. After Tom and Sharon speak, there will be some Q&A. Lee will be running around, I believe, with a handheld microphone, and Maggie has asked me to remind you to wait until he gets there, articulate your question into the microphone so that it is on the video record. So we will remind you that again. So join me in welcoming Tom and Sharon, and also consider this a round of applause for yourselves for being here to build a digital humanities community in Northern Ohio.
Thank you all for being here today. In the spirit of the Unconference, as Mark said, I don't think neither Sharon nor I are going to talk for very long. We haven't prepared lengthy remarks. I think what we're going to, I think we're listed on the program as the keynote address. I think we're going to emphasize the note part of that, not the key part of that. And I think we just want to leave you with some thoughts that can frame the discussions that we have later on with some observations that we have on the field of digital humanities, digital history in particular. So we'll try to keep this very, very brief so we can get straight to the discussion. I want to talk just very briefly then about 3 points of convergence that I have observed, of disciplinary convergence that I've observed as the digital becomes more pervasive in our lives, in our scholarship, and in the academy and cultural heritage fields in general. These 3 points of convergence, I think, are in general very positive, and they're connected as well. So I'll just leave you with these 3. The first one is between the convergence of digital history and digital humanities with public history and public humanities. Digital history, digital humanities, or at least the kind that's done online, is essentially a public act now. It wasn't always so. Digital humanities in one form or another, called by one name or another, humanities computing, it had other names in the past, has been going on for actually quite a long time. There was people might remember the statistical turn in history. People started counting things. That involved computers very early on. In literature, we've had text markup and text mining activities going on for a long time. But those, until the advent of the internet, of the web, those were essentially private activities. Those were activities that were done in maybe collaboratively, but in labs that weren't any more public than the public face for those activities was the journal article or other kind of traditional products. That's not so true anymore. We're now doing the work of digital humanities, of digital work in public, out on the web. Most of the work that we do is published in one form or another out there on the World Wide Web for everyone to see. So digital humanities has become more public. At the same time, public humanities has become more digital. And that's not just in museum websites and other kinds of websites. It extends to activities like oral history, which is now done almost entirely, it's an almost entirely born digital activity, born digital audio, born digital video. It's archived digitally, and it's distributed digitally through digital archives and podcasts and things like that. Digital has redefined what it means to, one of the things we talk about in public history a lot is the notions of co-authorship. That public history isn't authored by the historian for the public, it's authored with the public. The digital has changed that co-authorship to include things like social networking and other technologies. So we're reimagining the ways that we can co-author public humanities with our constituencies, with our audiences. So that's one kind, the convergence between digital humanities and public humanities. Second kind of convergence that I see is between public humanities, public history, and academic scholarship. Increasingly, scholarship is something that is done in public, whether the scholar actually intends to do that or not. We're seeing a huge increase in open access publishing. Not fast enough, I think, not enough of an increase for some of our tastes, but it is on the increase, where materials that were once only available to people who had access to this library or who bothered to come to this library, they're now out there on the web, accessible through search engines like Google Scholar. And increasingly, in fact, even institutions are coming up with open access policies where they're mandating or at least strongly encouraging scholars to make their works open access. We've seen the Compact for Open Access Publishing Equity it's a group of fairly elite universities, Harvard, Cornell, MIT, have banded together to support open access publishing on their campuses. In the sciences, this is especially true. A fairly new entrant into the science publication space is the Public Library of Science, which has now become, along with Nature and Science, one of 3 most respected publication venues for scientists. It's completely open access. It's completely available to the public. So what was once only available to scholars is now available to the public. And this extends, I think, to our research and our teaching. Even institutions that don't offer online courses, they're often participating in things like iTunes U. So even our teaching is increasingly more available online. More and more faculty members and graduate students have research blogs where they're documenting their research practice. And scholars and amateurs are meeting in places like footnote.com, where the National Archives and scholars are working with this footnote.com company to make things available, but it's a very popular destination for genealogists and others. So there's an increasing convergence between what used to be cloistered ivory tower academic scholarship and public engagement. So that's 2 kinds of convergence. The third kind, I would say, is within the university, within the cultural heritage community, within the professional community. We're seeing an increasing convergence between libraries, archives, museums, and scholars. In the library, in the cultural heritage field, they often use the acronym LAM, Libraries, Archives, Museums. I would add a U to that to make it LAMU, Libraries, Archives, Museums, and Universities. The web, where everything is available at our fingertips to a Google search, tends to break down the professional distinctions that divide people working on essentially the same materials, working on humanities materials. When I go to Google and I type in George Washington, I'm a member of the general public or a student or whatever, I don't really care if the result that I get and the result that I end up using in my paper, in my research, was put there by someone with an MLS or someone with a PhD or someone with a museum studies degree. I just want the stuff that I get. You know, I just want to find what I need and take it. And so for our publics, as we move online, those disciplinary distinctions tend to fall away. And I think that the digital humanities increasingly is also, in that recognition, is also starting to ignore those distinctions. One of the great things about digital humanities, I think one of the most exciting things for me about digital humanities is the opportunity and, in fact, the necessity that the digital humanities imposes to work with people who define themselves, their professional identity, as archivists or librarians or museum professionals. Almost all the projects that we do, and I think as Sharon will show you, are collaborations with, not just with scholars working in universities, but with scholars or professionals working in other kinds of institutions. And not just working as, the librarian is the service provider, and I am the patron, I am the customer. But working in very collaborative, very close ways, where really we become co-authors rather than this kind of service relationship. So those 3 areas of convergence, I think, will continue, those processes will accelerate as the digital becomes more and more important in our lives and in our work. We'll start to see an academy that is much more, which is essentially digital. I think a lot of times the work that we do is sort of incidentally digital these days. I think it will become more essentially digital. It will become born digital. There won't be a distinction, I guess, between digital humanities and humanities. That distinction will fall away. It will be essentially public. It will start public. We'll start our research projects with the public in mind. We won't be able to avoid that. We won't just end up being public because someone posted our syllabus online without our permission. It will always be first and foremost in our minds, and it will be essentially collaborative. It won't be an effort to work with a librarian, for a scholar to work with a librarian. We won't have to conceive a partnership. It'll just become a part of the essential nature of doing scholarship. So I think I think we'll see. I think this is a pretty diverse audience today. I think we see some of that convergence here today. I think we'll see some of that convergence in the lightning talks and the projects that we get to see. And those changes are, for me, changes that I really warmly welcome. And so I'm glad you're all here to advance some of those new opportunities for digital humanities today.
Let's see here. So I get the opportunity to follow Tom and talk a little bit in particular about public history and digital history in relationship to the kinds of things that Tom is pointing to in his notions of convergences. How many historians do we have in the room? A good number. Archivists? Museum curators? No? Both? OK, good. And so one of the things that I want to focus on for today is the notion of publicness and openness as having sort of two facets to it. It is this notion of access to materials, but it's also a notion of engagement with materials. And I think a really nice place for us to start is to think about how the National Council for Public History actually defines public history. This is a quote from their website. They spent a lot of time putting together this definition. But the board of directors defines public history as a movement, methodology, and approach that promotes the collaborative study and practice of history. Its practitioners embrace a mission to make their special insights accessible and useful to the public. Furthermore, public history is the conceptualization and practice of historical activities with one's public audience foremost in mind. It generally takes place in a setting beyond the traditional classroom. Its practitioners often see themselves as mediators on one hand between the academic practice of history and non-academics, and on the other hand between the various interests in society that seek to create historical understanding. Now, I don't know that all academic historians view their own work that way, but in the 17 years that we've had the Center for History and New Media, we have viewed our work that way, that our task in the world is to think about making materials available and teaching people how to think historically and how to deal with those materials. And so in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of conversation about what education should look like for the K-12 crowd, but also for the undergraduate crowd, and what public history should mean to the average citizen. So you'll find that last year, the Archivist of the United States had a blog post in which he talked about the notion of citizen archivists. And fully trained, academically prepared archivists responded with some upset about that. And it was modeling on this concept of citizen historians. I'm sorry, citizen scientists, who we would like to be citizen historians. In some ways, this is kind of a blurring of distinctions that not everyone is comfortable with, but we cannot fight the fact that it's actually happening. And anyone who's watched PBS or network television in the last 3 or 4 years and watch these shows where Henry Louis Gates or somebody else goes and tells some superstar about their genealogical background, there is energy behind this notion of public engagement with very personal questions about what history means. And so in that, I want to focus on why we as public historians sometimes don't engage those kinds of questions. If we look at what has won recognition as good public history in the last 10 or 15 years, we might be a little startled at the kinds of things that arise. Anyone familiar with the concept of the Muse Awards or Best of the Web Awards? They're annual awards for digital, I can't find my mouse. There we go. Digital public history projects. And they give us a guide to what people in the profession sort of think of as really good, noteworthy projects. And so in 2005, the National Museum of American History won a Muse Award for Best Web Exhibit for the Price of Freedom exhibit. And Price of Freedom is super slick. It's a very nicely designed piece of work. It's a flash exhibit that expands out of a timeline that tells the story of, sort of America's military past. And it was astoundingly expensive. It was hugely expensive. And it's gorgeous work. And Tom and I work with the National Museum of American History all the time. So don't get me wrong, I'm not bagging on NMAH by any means. But this site allows us to illustrate something that I think is a problem in the way we have heretofore conceived of what some digital public history work is doing. So the site is produced in conjunction with a huge exhibit that is a permanent ongoing exhibit started in 2004 in Military History Hall at National Museum of American History. And it presents the chronological history of American conflicts. But if we look at some of the ways in which this site has been reviewed in the Journal of American History and Public Historian, those sorts of things, we get a sense for where I'm going with this. Carol Emberton reviewed the site in the Journal of American History and said, "The exhibit's title suggests an interpretive stance that assumes freedom is and has always been the object of American military engagements. But freedom is a problematic term. And in failing to recognize how the meaning of freedom has been contested historically, the exhibit takes the viewer on a Whiggish stroll through American social and political history, conveniently including any desire he or she might have to rely on the facile belief in the mythic march of progress and democratic expansion." And she goes on to explain that the lack of a critical stance in the exhibit really engenders this notion of a heroic recovery of American political history. But she also then goes on to criticize the wealthy donor of the exhibit, and that perhaps the donor's wishes pushed us in one direction or the other. But I want to suggest that her first notion that there's an assumption, an uncontested assumption about the price of freedom, really gets at what we should be doing in public history. What we should be doing, and we know we should be doing this because we do it in our teaching, is that there's no question here. And for well over a decade, we produced very, very slick, beautiful sites that had no inquiry question. There's nothing for the user to really actively do here except for wander around. And there are a whole other list of sites that are like this. Another one, also hugely expensive, that won a Muse Award. I think it won a Muse Award. It might be an MCN award. Is the National Archives' new exhibit called Digital Vaults, which provides us with a look at all sorts of things from their collection, sorted solely by tag. And so I try to show this site on a regular basis, and I sometimes can't remember how to use it. And that's a problem, because it's a teaching and learning site, supposedly. But if you take a look at this, this is a document from NARA. It has tags, and it has some connection to some educational resources. You can put it in your collection, those sorts of things. There's no citation here. I mean, you've got a date, sort of. The constant circulating of the documents, you can't retrace your route. You can sort of gather things into your collection and answer a question with them, but it's basically glitz. It's $150,000 glitz. And this, in some cases, looks to the world like award-winning public history. But there's no history there. There's just documents. And the reason there's no history there is because one thing that we know from cognitive history in the last decade is that we know something about how people learn. We know some very concrete things about how people learn. And one of those things is that they have to have meaningful engagement with materials. And one way to do that in history is to scaffold an inquiry. And we all know that when we do history, we start with questions. And we go through a process by which we sort evidence and compare it and come to build a narrative answer to that question. But when we produce a site like this, or like The Price of Freedom, we've hidden all of that work. And so there is no real cognitive engagement for the public. And so in 2005, the National Academies published a sort of co-authored collection called How People Learn. And there were various iterations of it. And one of them was called How Students Learn, History in the Classroom. And here we're talking about K-12 people, but this could be your undergraduates. This could be your random public visitors. And applying these sort of things to lifelong learners, what the cognitive scientists tell us is that people come with preconceived notions about the world. We have to figure out what those are before we can start to have meaningful engagement with them. And then to develop competence in an area of inquiry, a student has to have deep factual knowledge that they can apply to a question. And then finally, they have to have some metacognitive recognition of the process that they're undergoing. And what we're starting to figure out and starting to model in digital public history is how actual historians engage with evidence, so that citizen historians can start to model those practices themselves. And again we go, again I lost my mouse. We go to the K-12 realm to look at something that might say, oops, I'm going to turn off my movie here if I can find the stop button.
The island of Cuba lies only 90 miles from the United States.
Turn that off. That if we ask students to actually answer questions using evidence, they start to learn how to do history. We're not asking the public to do this, the general public, in our public history. And so while we're thinking about access, we're not thinking about engagement. And so what I'd like to raise as a question for today is what we can do as digital humanists to put our own questions front and center. You'll notice that this investigation for 11th graders starts with an inquiry question. It's about the Spanish-American War, and they're supposed to be answering, why did the United States invade Cuba? And to do that, they actually have to read and engage with 6 or 7 historical primary sources. We don't ever ask the general public to self-consciously engage in these kinds of activities. And so as digital humanists, whether you're a public historian or whether you do religious studies, if we could make a step today to thinking about what kinds of core disciplinary or interdisciplinary questions we want to put front and center in our work that we want to share with the public so they start asking and modeling similar kinds of questions when they engage with something like digital vaults, when they engage with Flickr Commons. If we're going to find ourselves in a world of commons culture, where everything is available in some digital framework and people have access to all of our cultural heritage, if they don't know how to frame an inquiry question to do anything with it, we're not going to see the creation of that community. And so if we think about the public as an extension sometimes of our undergraduates, the kinds of metacognitive things that we want our students to do, we as public humanists, as public historians, need to think about ways to frame our digital work so that the general public can start to ask and participate in some of those kinds of inquiries. And so my mission for today is to think about what kind of learning can we engender on a societal level with our own digital productions. So that's where I am for today. And we can talk for a few minutes about the kinds of work that we have done at the center through the years to try and think about some of these things. Do you want to? I don't know where we are time-wise.
Why don't we take questions and you intersperse the talk?
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
good.
that makes sense.
I only had one thing to say before questions. I was remiss in not thanking the 5 colleges who are here, and Salsich, and stand up. And is Catalina here? Catalina Euler? And Catalina Euler, who helped us in the organization. And in fact, Bill and I talked about putting this together, we thought it was really critical that the 5 colleges were not only represented, but that we could begin to build that filter from, how should we say it, from south to north, north to south. They have a grant going on which is addressing these very questions. So the idea was to actually build this conversation across geography as well. Everybody from the 5 colleges, raise your hand, and we're going to thank you for coming out. Yay! All right. My apology, Anne, for not mentioning that earlier. Lee is there with questions? So somebody raise your hand.
You're there with the microphone.
He has the mic. Lee is there with the microphone.
Questions, comments?
Hi. I wanted to ask if I could invite you to take your thoughts even further into kind of projects that might label themselves more for a scholarly audience. Because you were really talking about a kind of public engagement, but then going back to your earlier point that once it's on the web, it's already public. Mm-hmm. And I began to think about projects in art history. I just happened to stroll across one recently called Visualizing Cultures that MIT has done, which has this great database of images. But then I began wondering, oh, does it have a scholarly question? And I know it does, because I know the people.
What it is.
Yeah, and I know the people. So I just wondered if you could maybe extend that, not just for this kind of notion of to what degree do you feel that that's incumbent on a project, no matter what its sort of aim, audience, particularly those projects that might be done by academic researchers. Right. But again, knowing that they are going to go public, how much responsibility for making that inquiry public do you feel a project has to have?
Well, I think that we're in a sort of interesting position, particularly on that count, because if you're a digital humanist and you're in a traditional university setting, and you have a traditional tenure-track job, your database may not have the normal trappings of scholarship that your colleagues recognize. And if we listen to, it's Lev Manovich, right? Database thinking. That there's a logic, and archivists all know this, that there's an internal logic, even if it's not spoken, to the creation of those collections. And so we need to speak it so that we get credit for the knowledge creation that we're engaging in creating those kinds of resources. We need to post a white paper with it. There has to be some intellectual rationale with the site. I
have a very sort of particular view on this, that at this stage of digital humanities, when we're dealing with the technology, we're dealing with the printing press, in the 1480s. Like we're like very early in all of this, and I think that my feeling is the job of the digital humanities at this point is really to experiment with the new medium, and that it's okay if our work doesn't necessarily answer big scholarly questions right now. That our job is to look at methods. So if we're not advancing academic theory, I think that's fine. I think what we are doing is advancing method. But I do agree with Sharon that we then have to talk about how we're advancing the method. The work of the digital humanist then is to, in many ways, I think, tinker with these new toys that we have, but then talk about what that means. So it's a bit of a difference in outlook. I think it's a different expectation for the humanist. The humanist is normally supposed to answer, the big questions. I don't necessarily think digital humanists have to do that at this stage. I think we need to explore the possibilities of these tools before they can answer big questions for us. But as we do that, we need to document our experiments and talk about our experiments so that our colleagues can learn from them, so that they can take the technology and the techniques even further, so that we can start to approach those big questions in new ways. I think it's going to take a little bit longer to fully explore these technologies than the 15 years that we've had exploring the web.
I have a two-part question. First of all, I'm trained as an interdisciplinary scholar in American studies with an emphasis on material culture. So I've just been part of a project in Connecticut to create an online state encyclopedia, and they never ever heard of an artifact or an image that just wasn't illustrative rather than evidence in and of itself. And so I worry that, as much as I like digital humanities, that there is this dilemma, and I see it both in the examples you showed, that we represent at this moment not interdisciplinarity but biases, disciplinary biases, right, or even political biases. And what the price of freedom. I reviewed that, and the review didn't get accepted because it was so visceral. So for a scholarly journal, so I understand that. So I think that's problem number one. How do we then think about the humanities in general rather than stay within our disciplinary walls as we represent what we do, right? And that if we have these citizens who think differently, how do we understand that beyond our disciplinary boundaries? Secondly, then, and speaking as a professional, in material culture, what happens? And we see this trend in museums and historical societies across the United States where curatorial knowledge, specific knowledge, is being trumped by collections management. That the number of curators who have that specific knowledge and are the persons who acquire new things to create new knowledges are going down the tubes, right? The numbers are, in a VISO are decreasing. At the same time that we have digital humanities who want to put those collections up, that we're at this other point where there actually is a professional ethics involved in representing what we represent. So.
No. There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot to tackle there. No, I agree.
What happens when you knit and think?
I agree that there is often a tendency to to ignore content area knowledge when doing these projects. I think I certainly wouldn't advocate playing with the technology outside of the knowledge of the content. I think that the two go hand in hand. I think, as Mark said, that it starts with humanities, and it would be a mistake to have people who aren't trained in the humanities doing this work. One of the things I think one of our strengths at the Center for History and New Media is we are all trained historians. My PhD's in history, Sharon's PhD's in American Studies, Jeremy is getting his PhD in American history, Sheila has her PhD in American history. Jeremy does a lot of the tool building, the actual code level production and development. I think it's very important that it's humanists doing this experimentation, we're not just hiring computer science graduates to do it for us. So it shouldn't be a vendor relationship that we have with the technology. It should be an intimate relationship that we have with the technology so that we can bring our subject area knowledge to the technology development, even at the level of the database design, at the level of tool building, because we know the questions we need to answer. The best digital humanities is done by humanists, and in fact, we've found we have we've over the years had a few computer science grads who've worked for us and with us, but for the most part, our best programmers are people with a humanities background, who are self-taught in the technology because they've seen that the technology is something that can help them in their humanistic pursuits, not the other way around.
I mean, your two questions are not at all unrelated. And there is a huge push going on right now to mount ginormous collections databases online. The V&A, the Powerhouse, all of these museums are providing access to everything that they've got. But they're also accompanying that access with an API so that other people can use their content in interesting ways. Mark mentioned when he introduced Tom and I that we're co-directors of the Emeka project. And Emeka is a software created specifically for cultural heritage professionals and actually addresses your first problem in kind of an interesting way that you couldn't do it without the technology. And that is that because Emeka is designed for cultural heritage professionals, the software allows you to create and convey knowledge in two ways. First, there is the core archive of content. And so there are the items in the archive, and you'll notice that this site on Martha Washington has an archive, but it also has a narrative exhibit. And so one way that we can sort of hopefully remedy that sort of notion of this ossifying of our biases in our narrative work is to also present all of the evidence at the same time. And so users who come to an Emeka site that is a digital exhibit get the voice of the curator and the curator's understanding of the content, but also have full access to all of the evidence, all of the materials that go along with it. That brings us back to Anne's question about database thinking and the logic behind creating the database. But it gets us a whole lot closer than sort of the unsourced data, like narrative dump of the earlier digital exhibits. And so, Dan Cohen has talked about this, that the best digital humanities work allows a separation of the sources from the narrative interface in some way that allows us to come back and reevaluate those sources and revisit them. And so, 15 years from now, we know something else about Martha Washington. We can write a new narrative and still use the core archive. And so, but the whole reason we produced Emeka was to allow an easy way for curators to communicate that knowledge through an easy-to-use software so that expertise, in fact, doesn't get lost in this move to put collections online, because we know that collections can't stand alone. Sources can't stand alone. The problem with that digital vaults thing is it totally stands alone. and that people who have some knowledge need to share it in conjunction with that data.
Right. I would just add one further thing. I would say some of this responsibility is on the curators. One of the things we found with working with museums are it's often the public programs people, the exhibits people, the marketing department, whatever, who are interested in engaging with the web content. And the curators are either, whether it's because they haven't been given the opportunity or whatever it is, they're less, they oftentimes don't see it as part of their job to be talking in public about their materials, that it's not, that it's just, they're stewards of the collection. They provide expertise for label text and those kinds of things, but they're not really part of, they shouldn't really be involved in the web production. We built Emeka to try to facilitate some of that work, to allow them to tell stories about their collections, because it really is the curators who are most prepared to do that. But I think that when the web has come into the museum, and I think that it's incumbent on curators. I mean, you don't see many curators at museums in the web, for instance. Museums in the web. Why is that? There need to be. I think there needs to be a greater engagement of the curator with the technology as well.
It's because the representation you have of what a curator does is kind of like a historian with objects, and that's really untrue. An archivist, working with documents, you put the document online, a historian can read it, right? And so historians aren't curators. Curators aren't historians. I mean, if I really wanted to represent a curatorial vision, I'd have to put provenance up on that object.
Yeah,
and I can't do that because there are legal ramifications to that. So to assume that in some ways the academic scholar's way of accessing and thinking about documents, images, and artifacts is portable to representing other professionals in the field, I think is problematic. I mean,
I'll grant that, but I also, but then okay, then go do what it is you need to do. I mean, that I throw it back then. If what we're providing for you is not what you need, then, but it can't just be, I will maintain that there is a reluctance for people whose job has not been a public job in the past. They have not had a public face in the library, in the museum, in the way that maybe the web now expects. There is, I think, a shift of responsibility for those people whose jobs had in the past been private jobs. In the world of this open web, there's a responsibility of those people to play a more public role, and whatever that should be. And it is, you're absolutely right. It's the professional, whatever that professional is, has the best sense of what that role should be. But I think we need to, those professionals then need to put themselves out there and do that work.
As a museum curator, I too am really frustrated by a lot of my colleagues who I've primarily worked at large museums, and they're in kind of cloistered positions. We are in kind of cloistered positions where we have all the objects to ourselves. They're fragile, they're valuable, you really have to worry about conservation of the way they're handled. Access is very limited to them. You want to know why somebody wants access to something before you actually give it to them. So curators are used to being in this kind of monkish atmosphere, and oftentimes they haven't kept up with technology. I could use a lot more help with technology myself. But I get really frustrated with curators because they sometimes are holding down collections and restraining access to things that the collections managers are giving access to. So I have a soft spot in my heart for collections managers and also for the conservators, because nobody knows objects like the conservators do, and they need more credit, and their research and information needs to get out there as well. So all of these things have to work in hand, and somehow curators need to get up to speed with technology.
I think this is, I certainly wouldn't want this to be Pick on Curators Day. I think this is true. I think this is true in all of these institutions that are interested in humanities. This negotiation over public and private and whose job it is to be the public professional and whose job it is to be the private professional, those lines are really shifting and they're being renegotiated. And so, I mean, you see it in libraries as well. I mean, there's a certain kind of librarian who's used to sitting in the back room, and then there's a certain kind of librarian who's used to sitting in the front room. And the web kills that. I mean, it breaks that whole thing down. And so those people who have been in back, they're now expected to be out front, or someone puts them out front, or seizes responsibility for stuff that used to be theirs in ways that are maybe hurtful or unhelpful or not as useful as they could be without their help. So I think this is, and it's certainly true in university departments. I mean, this is true all around, and this negotiation of public and private, open and closed, we're really just, and this is where the tinkering with the technology and the continuing experiment comes in. We need to find a new equilibrium between our public and our private roles and responsibilities.
But I think this is really where digitization, thank you. I think this is really where digitization is fabulous, because it's really leveling the playing field. It's making access to objects more ready. And it's also helping to preserve objects, because if you have photographs of them, and if you have a series of detailed photographs, if somebody's interested in the details of something, then you're protecting the object too, because somebody can get a lot of studying done from the images of the objects before they actually have access to the objects. So it helps with conservation, it helps with access, and it also is beginning to really draw material. I think material culture and academics are still pretty separate. At Oberlin, one of the historians has a program about walking across the street, getting people to go from out of your building and go to the art museum to see what's there. And then, of course, once you get to the art museum, if you're an academic, well, you're not an art historian, so can we really talk about this? But in fact, that historian has a lot to offer in terms of the object. So what I love about the 21st century is that this tendency we've had for so long to specialize, get more and more and more specialized, and you sort of don't go to, if you're in a science department, you don't go to a humanities department, because it's, how do you know, how can you speak their language? Now we're really hopefully encouraging everybody, and especially with this digitization, into really reaching out, reaching across walls, breaking down those walls, and beginning to share information and knowledge. And I just think this is really incredibly exciting. I think one of the big problems is terminology. You know, and language, and how do we understand each other? But in any case, I think it's a fabulous thing.
And it will not be published on paper, it will be published digitally. And not to belabor the point, I would be done with my project if some archives were available in a much more friendly manner. And in Cleveland, especially, you have museums their libraries are only open a few days, evenings, forget it, nothing on the website. If you wanted to look at the city of Cleveland's building department records, go play putt-putt, because forget it, it ain't gonna work. And so my question is, there's obviously the need is there and a paradigm shift. So is there an effort in your professional organizations to lobby and make the changes that have just been talked about And I have to assume that one of those is in the education of the young archivists that are probably here today, to not have that attitude of, why do you need to have it? Did you pay for the $8 worth of parking to get inside? By the way, we close at 3, and we only get things every half an hour. To be, and all that would allow then going in a circle here, because there's a reason why I'm repeating some of the things people said. It all goes back in the circle when you want to have the public involved in conducting history on the web, not just looking at it. It then allows them to dig and find more and more, which then allows them and others to ask more questions about why was that building there and why is that doorway there. And I guess that's all I got to say.
I mean, I certainly hope so. I mean, you know, I think that sort of I think that the Society of American Archivists has done amazing work in creating standards that allow some of this to be possible, but there's also got to be sort of realism about the ways in which descriptive standards are applied and materials made available. But I don't want to suggest that historians, academic historians, are any bright shining light of anything on this. You know, I mean, you know, you go to the AHA and there are, in 2010, there were 9 digital panels at the AHA. It was a little bit better in 2011. Hopefully in 2012, it'll be really much better. But, you know, this talk about digital natives, it's all hooey. Digital Luddites. Graduate schools are full of digital Luddites. So, you know, I think it's just, you know, it's not a generational thing. It's not a generational thing. And so, you know, we can try. You know, at George Mason, the graduate degree in history at George Mason, the whole reason the PhD program exists is because of the focus in new media. That's one PhD program.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, historically, you know, there's an awful lot of suspicion and resentment between all these people working in really on the same stuff. You know, all interested in humanities questions and humanities content. And I think the digital does offer opportunities for breaking down those barriers. As I said, I think between, you know, historians working in academic settings, historians not working in academic settings, between librarians and historians, or archivists and scholars, between libraries and museums. You know, these have all been, you know, fairly guarded citadels in the past. And I think we're doing a lot of work because we're all facing a set of common questions, and it behooves us to work together rather than working against one another. We're doing a lot of things because it's not just going to be something that generational, it's not a generational problem that time will just solve. We're doing a lot of things to try to bring together these groups. I think today is an example of that. Our That Camp program is an example of that. We had an institute this summer called 1 Week, 1 Tool, where we brought together 12 diverse practitioners, tenured faculty members in various disciplines, lit, history, religion, others, some museum professionals, some librarians, some archivists, some programmers, some graduate students, some undergraduates, some senior faculty, all kinds.
There were really only 12.
There were 12, but they were all very, each person came with a different disciplinary background, came with a different professional background, came with, different ages, different technical competencies. We got together on the first day or two. We decided a tool that we would build that we could all use in our work, and we got down to business and we built it in a week. And forcing those people to really work together and work together in a very high pressure environment on something of mutual interest showed that we can work together, first of all, and second of all, that we really do have a lot of common aims, common goals, and a lot of common background that the digital can help us understand and further. So we're actively working to try to break down those barriers.
in keeping with our unconference theme, this is an unquestion because it may end up being about scholarship, but it may end up being about teaching, I'm not sure. I have occasionally put an essay or a conference paper out online, and by doing so, it became public by default, right? I don't know how public it really was, but theoretically it was public. But then if we take a look at the really slick, you said it was the Museum of American History? Yes. You know, that looks really good, but apparently it's, you know, radically missing kind of critical inquiry scaffolding that one might expect on, you know, in scholarly work. And so I guess it seems to me that there's this and I think you touched on this, but there's this sort of, the public works in both ways. There's scholarship that becomes public, and then there's stuff like the museum is doing that is meant to be public, right? I mean, that's its intention, okay? So I could just imagine, now here comes the teaching part. I can just imagine when I'm telling my students, you're gonna have to be responsible for reputable stuff. If it's on the internet, that's fine, but it has to be reputable. That looks really reputable, right? It looks really good, and yet, you know, I'm not sure they have the critical apparatus to.
Yeah, I mean, it's not disreputable, but it's like a textbook. There is no sense of authorial voice, of perspective, of secondary perspective, and so it really does. It reads like a textbook, and so if your students aren't prepared to differentiate between textbook type delivery and much more plainly perspectival work of secondary sources, then they're not going to know the difference in the library either.
It also struck me that there's a kind of comfort to that site because it looks good and it feels like you're being active because you're clicking through stuff, but in some ways it's, at least the way you describe it, I haven't looked at it, it's like it's entertainment.
That is exactly the problem with it, is that there is this illusion of engagement, unless you as an instructor have, you know, done something to send them there with an inquiry question to challenge the hidden perspective of the authors.
So I want to ask two quick questions. What's the role of tools in the digital humanities? I made the statement earlier that it starts with the humanities but becomes digital. I think one could clearly make the case that it's digital, using humanistic methods, but the tools are really important. And I'm thinking in particular as a way to just spur this question. Anthologize, right, as a tool, or Omeka as a tool where the value of Omeka increases when a collective of people use the tools and develop the tools, so that in a sense the Center for History and New Media gives birth to Omeka, but the community raises it, you know, to use Hillary Clinton's model.
It takes a village to make a website.
The other is a separate question, and it's a follow-up on Jeffrey's question about access. I am a proponent of openness, but sometimes I need to be convinced. So remind me why I care about radical openness, that everything should be open, that we should get rid of the silos altogether and create an open-air bazaar of historical archives and materials.
Which first?
Okay, I'll tackle the tools question. I can tackle the other one too if you want. The tools building thing. I mean, some of the tool building is just very pragmatic. It's we see a need and there isn't anything off the shelf that fills it, and we say, you know what, we can build that. And Zotero, our research management system, research management platform, is very much like that. I mean, there are reference management programs out there, EndNote, other RefWorks, things that will build a bibliography for you. But we found in 2004, 2005, that those tools don't work very well with the web. The web is the place that we do, when I was writing my dissertation in the late 90s, and I was doing a lot of research, most of the research was actually done in the library, not kind of online. EndNote worked really well because I'd find something, I'd type it in, it would, and that process worked well. But once everything's in the browser, once all your research is done in the browser, having to flip between this window and then close that window and then add something to another window and then open that back up and flipping back and forth didn't seem to work with the new research flow of the digital age. And so we thought, you know what? We can put the research management database in the browser, and it will work with this new web-based research workflow. So it's sort of solved a practical need. In doing that, in solving some practical problems, though, you learn a lot about what it means to do scholarship, the nature of humanities knowledge, and other things. I'll point to Anthologize. One of the things we really learned in building Anthologize was, and let me explain what Anthologize is. Anthologize is basically a tool that takes your blog and turns it into an ebook. So you've been blogging for 5 years, you've got a lot of posts, you've got some good ones, there's some long ones, some short ones, some good ones, some bad ones. There's a lot of text there. You've got, let's say you've got 100,000 words written. Well, maybe you want to turn that into something that's maybe more recognizable to one of your traditional colleagues. Anthologize is a tool that works with the WordPress blog publishing platform. It sits in WordPress and allows you to take all of that content that you've been generating over the past months and years, to reorganize it, to edit it within the browser, to merge posts together, to separate them, to organize them into chapters, to format them, and then to spit them out as a PDF or an EPUB or a Kindle book or what have you, to kind of transform this web-based writing into something that looks more like traditional scholarly monograph production or whatever. And one of the things you learn, so it's a cool tool, it works, it's fun, it's useful. But one of the things you actually really learn about it in building it is the difference between web-based digital writing and sort of traditional scholarly writing that you might do on a typewriter or a word processor, and how the rhetorical conventions differ, how the formatting conventions differ, how the voice differs. And so you really learn something about what it is to do and be a humanist in the process of building the tool, in the process of going from one thing to another. So it's that iterative process of tinkering with the technology and doing the humanities that can be really enlightening in tool building. So Sharon, I'll leave the hard open source, open access question to you.
Yes. All right, well, the open source question is not the question you asked, but I'll answer it anyway.
It's the easier question.
It's the way, I appreciate that. All of the stuff that we build is open source. And we build using open source platforms. So we use Linux as our server stuff, and we build with PHP and MySQL. There are other open source options. There are a lot of reasons we do this. One, it totally lowers our overhead costs. We don't pay for software. We do. Like, I have Microsoft Word on here. We pay a little bit for software, but we don't pay for expensive software licenses. And so that leaves us more resources to spend on the content and to spend on thinking about what building these kinds of tools, how they work with doing humanities work. But it also allows us to do something like Emeka, which we'll go back to Emeka. Emeka and Zotero are both open source in that we build them and we care for them and we're responsible for some sort of sustainability for them, but they have both engendered large developer and user communities that support and sustain the software. And so it's not unrelated to the open access question. If we think that our cultural heritage is important, the way to support and sustain it is to make it available so that people have a stake in it. If we want educated citizens, we want educated, engaged citizens, they have to know that your collections are important to their own cultural life. And the only way they can do that is to have access to them. And so the questions are not unrelated. They're about sustainability for all of us.
I'll also, and I think that is absolutely, the practical case. I'll also make a political and a moral case.
You paid for it.
The public paid for it. And if you're at a state university, the public pays your salary. Or a state institution, the public pays your salary. The taxpayer pays your salary. If you're funded by government grants, the taxpayer pays for the research. If you're at a private institution, you don't pay any tax. Your institution doesn't pay any taxes. That's a direct subsidy from the government. So the taxpayer is funding you. The taxpayer should have access to your product. I see a very clear political and moral case for that. And I think if we want the public to support us, if we want to continue getting tax breaks, if we want to continue getting government funds, we better be out there with our work so the public can have a stake in it, as Sharon said.
I work at one of the private organizations that gets the tax breaks. There's a real tension there. Those tax breaks don't pay for what we do. And that's the reason our library is only open 3 days a week now, because we are a nonprofit organization and it is very difficult to get the support we need in order to get us back up to having more hours. And I take your comment on the parking. We need that money in order to do what we do. It's all about revenue generating so that we can get that stuff in front of you to make it accessible and to get it organized so that we're not just putting a box of junk in front of you and telling you to have a nice day. And it's a real tension, and one of the reasons I wanted to come here is to get some ideas on the tension between a nonprofit organization that's struggling to put the content in front of the humanities, and at the same time the humanities coming in and always telling us, you're never doing enough. You need to be out there talking to us. Well, as long as I'm talking to you, I'm not processing, I'm not collecting, I'm not advocating for getting more funding for my program. And so there's a real, I think, a natural tension there that's not necessarily unhealthy, but there's a real tension there between, you know, you pay what is our $50 a year for a membership, that gets you unlimited resources at our place. That doesn't come close to paying for what we have to put into making those collections accessible. We want to make them accessible. It's the whole reason we do what we do. And for us to collect, when you come into our library, we want to know, why do you want to use this material? We collect that data so that we can go out and collect what you want. That if we see a trend of researcher after researcher coming in and saying, I want to see this stuff because here's what I'm doing, we can then go out and say, we'll get you more collections that you can use. But we need that information in order for us to serve you better. Because we don't know what to collect if you don't tell us what to collect. And so that's why we collect that information, and we're really interested in what you're doing. So what do you think of the funding aspect of it? How a university is funded is very, very different from how a charity is funded.
Well, we're a nonprofit too, and we're a division of our history department, but we get almost no funding from the university. We're completely almost completely grant-driven as well. And so, you know, I sympathize. No.
So your salaries you go out and find as well?
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, we have 50 staff members, which amounts to about 30 or so FTE. And we are 90% grant funded. So, you know, 90% of those people, it's not actually 90% because that's not how it's broken up, but we're 90% of those people are on soft money, as they call it. Yeah.
Yeah.
We get no funding from the university. We just generate revenue.
But like your
Yeah, so there's indirect. So they take a chunk of the.
But every time I write a grant,
they take 35% to.
Yeah, they take
to pay for the lights.
they take essentially a third of every dollar I bring.
We're actually
they do for us too, actually.
Yeah.
A third of what I bring in goes straight to the
We're actually a net revenue center for the university. So we do. It's not this. You know, the economics aren't exactly the same, but we understand. You know, we get that problem, and we face it ourselves. You know, it's very tough. I think it's tougher for institutions that were born in a pre-digital age than an institution that was born in the digital age like ours. Some of it is going to, I mean, it's some of it, and it's going to take a long time to shake out. But some of it is going to be a rebalancing of kind of traditional mission with the new 21st century mission, and that's going to take a long time to shake out. Where, maybe for 50 years more money goes to access than it does go to acquiring more, to acquisitions. Those economics are still shaking out. I think that's part of the experimentation of digital humanities is not just with the stuff and the content and the production. I think one of the core challenges that the digital humanities present is not just to humanities knowledge and content, but it's to the ways humanists work. And it's to the structures that fund and organize humanities labor. We do an awful lot of challenging the American Historical Association to change the way it works. We do an awful lot of challenging the traditional job markets to change the way they work, the funding agencies to change the way they work. So we're presenting not only a challenge to traditional scholarship, but also a challenge to traditional structures. And so I think we're in a process of experimenting with those things, and we don't have really good answers to those questions yet.
One last challenge: traditional structures. So one last question before we break.
Great, it's pressure. So I have taken that economic issue. There are a few of us that are undergrads, just graduated, trying to figure out how we get involved and how we start. And in an economic situation that it's hard to find the entry-level job or survive as getting a master's degree in history that's not being, so a lot of if you're just doing a terminal master's, aren't supported. So what do you suggest for students that are trying to get involved and trying to make a living wage while still wanting to be digital historians? Where do we go for the education coming out of being, the College of Worcester tells me I'm a trained historian, so where do I go from there?
I can give you a very practical piece of advice. I mean, I don't have the answer. It's tough out there, but I can give you a very practical piece of advice. Go to dreamhost.com, get yourself a $5 a month account, and do a one-click installation of WordPress, and learn how to hack WordPress. Okay. Buy a book and teach yourself how to hack WordPress. I guarantee you, if you spend a year while you're doing other stuff, it has to be in your free time. Nobody's gonna pay you to do this. But if you spend a year learning how to hack WordPress, build a theme for WordPress, maybe build a plugin for WordPress, he'll hire you. No, or I'll hire you. That is a skill and it will give you an entry into the kinds of skills that are most in demand in the field of digital humanities. If you learn how to do that, there will be a job for you in digital humanities. I promise you.
Now this is value added. You come to a conference and you get a job all of the same.
There's like 7 of us in the room that are recent or going to be graduates. So
I would say, just from the technology perspective, that's probably the single best thing you can know at this moment in digital humanities. That's probably the single most useful thing that you can know, and it's the best entry point for kind of going even further.
We're going to stop here. Thank you so much, Sharon and Tom, for this.